Well, thank you for coming, and thanks, Ellie, for inviting me to present. I've done this a couple times now that with CIT and Ed Tech, even though this is just my third year. But Ellie, when she invites me to do this, this is a big favor to me because, and maybe you know this already, but my area of scholarship is digital pedagogy. So the teaching and research go hand in hand for me. So what I'm going to present today reflects both kind of my thinking about this as an academic and as a teacher, which is a hard line to kind of draw sometimes. So recently I've been participating in a scholarly experiment called a CrowdReview. A journal in my field is called Post-Medieval. I'm a medievalist by training. A journal of medieval cultural studies has decided to replace the traditional double-blind peer review with an open, transparent, and online review process for a forthcoming issue on new media. Now, in their vision statement for this issue, the editors defend their use of the term crowd review to characterize this process by suggesting the concept of the crowd to some might seem particularly inimical to academic institutions or professionalism. Crowds imply mobs. Crowds imply amateur opinion, cajoling, and yelling. But crowds also now connect with activities like crowdsourcing, an open call for collaboration among a large group of informed participants interested in exploring, creating, or solving. And crowds also change things. The crowd potentially embodies an exciting challenge to the isolation and insularity of traditional academic organizations as an opportunity to experiment with the restructuring of professional and disciplinary affiliation. So rather than submit to the pejorative connotation of the mob mentality, the editors embrace the wisdom of the crowd, inviting everyone to read and comment upon essays that have been posted to a blog. Now, the only requirement is that every commenter must divulge their identities to keep the process transparent, a value that undermines an aspect of peer review that many of us hold sacrosanct, which is anonymity. Now, I certainly sympathize with and understand the logic behind blind review, namely that it often mitigates personal biases and licenses the reviewer to evaluate the work on its merits alone. Yet I've become increasingly convinced that transparency, particularly within cyberspace, has a number of benefits that may at times outweigh the advantages of anonymity. Now, if you happen to attend my previous presentation here about online role-playing and about anonymity and role-playing, this may come as a surprise, because I had argued then that blog avatars or anonymous online identities provide writers safe and empowering perspectives to express their opinions boldly and often aggressively. And I do believe this. So I had talked about in my last presentation my Arthurian literature students who contribute to a class blog by writing from the points of views of characters in course texts. And they would consistently produce lively prose, engage in debates. I mean, students like to debate, and especially when they don't know who's debating whom. And even push the limits of the genres they inhabit. Even more importantly, the inability to identify the fellow bloggers immensely democratizes the rhetorical situation. The expertise or knowledge of the writer can only be determined within the dynamic experience of the online dialectic. That is, the anonymous contributor, who may be anyone, challenges traditional notions of epistemological authority, which rely upon an a priori location of authority in a credentialed specialist. Now, just like blogs, wikis, especially Wikipedia, value a posteriori expertise. Only through collaborative production, verification, and approval does information become authoritative. Wikipedians don't care if you're a distinguished professor or a high school dropout. Authority is produced and sanctioned through popular and extensive compilation and collaboration, not through academic pedigree. So I still believe all of that. So despite these democratizing benefits of online anonymity, a transparency problem can arise, particularly when the stakes are raised. For instance, if someone manipulates information online in favor of a particular political program without divulging their allegiances or their identity, it's difficult for subsequent responders to evaluate the core assumptions behind the material. And this in turn leads to what can be, in some cases, a mindless consumption of digitally produced media. As Henry Jenkins has suggested, our students have become increasingly adept at manipulating information online, but surprisingly inept at evaluating it. Long ago now, Sherry Turkle, one of the most influential media theorists, had attributed this pervasive ineptitude to a lack of transparency, which she claims encourages people to get used to manipulating a system whose core assumptions they do not see and which may or may not be true. Now, when identities, convictions, and sources are made transparent online, information can be evaluated responsibly and used more effectively. Now, within academic structures of peer review, this means that critiques that need clarification or justification can be negotiated between writer and reviewer. Moreover, divulging the identity of the reviewer will also, in most cases, reveal the research programs, particular agendas, and sometimes even certain schools of thought that inform the critiques. So this information allows the writer to situate the reviewer's response within a specific context that may be otherwise unavailable through blind review. Now, in addition to transparency, CrowdReview offers a high volume of feedback that really is impossible for most editorial teams to match. Whereas most journals in the humanities, and I can only speak really about the humanities, can offer at most 3 reviews of a standard article, and I've only experienced that one time, 3 reviews. Most of the time it's been less than 3. A crowd of reviewers can more than quadruple that number. So for instance, this is the CrowdReviews site. Let's see if we can go directly to it here. As of August 29th, last time I checked this, one of the essays I commented upon in the crowd review had already received 13 responses, many of which contained live links to relevant resources. And I'll just spin through this quickly here. Each paragraph is numbered just to help facilitate the commentary, but at the end of the essay, you have, so there are 14 responses. You have a listing of the comments, and you can see it there. Some of them are quite short, some of them are longer with hyperlinks. And, as I said, each commenter has to identify themselves, so if you click on, it should lead to a page that identifies the person. Okay, in this case, it's a Twitter account. This is a George Washington University professor. So visitors to the site can see that the reviewers, and if I were to go through each reviewer, you would see this, they boast a variety of educational backgrounds and academic specialties, all of which are specifically invested in particular aspects of the work at hand. Okay, so they may not all be English professors, they could be from other fields as well. And perhaps more importantly, the crowd review accelerates peer review from dialogue into a kind of hyper-dialogue by allowing writers to respond directly and immediately to reviewers' comments in order to clarify or even challenge critiques. Now, this kind of public negotiation requires that writers and reviewers be particularly careful about the relevancy and reliability of their comments, aspects that I think will undoubtedly improve the review process and the eventual scholarly product. Now, this kind of improvement has certainly proven to be the case for the genre called fan fiction, which has long held such collective intelligence as integral to its popularity. Before the advent of the World Wide Web, fans of popular media such as Star Trek, produced and disseminated their written elaborations of the standard plot lines and relationships between characters through printed zines. But once fans began to migrate their communities to online environments, the scope and depth of their influence increased dramatically. Now, the hotbed of activity is located at fanfiction.net, which is not only the largest digital archive of fan texts, it contains approximately 500,000 Harry Potter texts alone, but also a highly multilingual writing space containing stories in at least 30 languages. Now, online fan fiction has proven to be particularly attractive to English language learners, whose multilingual participation is valued and encouraged. As Rebecca Black has shown, and Rebecca Black, by the way, is a UMass Boston grad, female ELLs have utilized manga and anime fan fiction as a means to improve their English. In the case of a writer she identifies as Grace, the production of her fan text Heart Song, which was envisioned as part of the Card Captor Sakura manga series, required the use of multilingual and interpersonal registers. She not only humbly advertises herself as the fastest, quickest, and yet poor English writer from the Philippines, but also invites her audience to R&R, which means read and review, assuming that her readers would be capable of negotiating between English and Japanese. And here's a brief excerpt of her story, which I won't read, but you can just see that she switches back and forth. Now, this linguistic transparency and editorial flexibility led to the creation of a 15-chapter text and a 15-chapter sequel demanded by a fan community who offered a staggering 1,569 reviews of her work over a 5-year period. Now, the sheer volume of response, which proved to be incredibly productive for Grace, demonstrates that crowds offer collective resources and motivations that individual experts or writing teachers cannot hope to match. So over the past year in my teaching, I've adapted the spirit of open critique for what I would like to call a crowd pedagogy. While a blog can provide a suitable format for these collaborative productions of knowledge, I've recently preferred wikis. Just because they're easy to use, easily adaptable, and they also show the text and the commentary, at least if you don't use the discussion feature and just use the page as the discussion thread on the same page. My first try at this crowdsourcing resulted in a wiki page I playfully called Romancing the Tome, which provided an online space for my understanding literature students to respond to course texts and each other on the same page. And to ensure transparency, the students were required to identify themselves through their full names or initials. Now, because the responses could be traced back to particular students, students were often resistant to confront each other with refutations, challenges, or even minor critiques of previous comments. On the other hand, the wiki did allow students to elaborate on topics that we didn't have time to address in class. So in this sense, the wiki functioned as an extension of classroom dialogue. I realized, however, that the cost of transparency was often the loss of candor in the discussions. So to recapture this feature, which is characteristic of a lot of anonymous blogging, I implemented a response structure that I stole from Peter Taylor, our colleague here at UMass Boston. I learned of this during his 2010 Inter-College Faculty Seminar, Engaging Colleagues in Caring Collaborations. He asked the faculty in the seminar to respond to a piece of writing he had posted to a wiki through the following dialectical method, which has been developed by Peter Elbow and Patricia Belanoff, called Believing and Doubting, and some of you in this room, I'm sure, know this. Essentially, you ask your readers to respond using the believing heuristic, thinking about your writing, kind of giving it the benefit of the doubt. That is, even if you disagree strongly, your job is to pretend to agree. And then on the opposite side of that is doubting, right, which a lot of us do quite easily, right? You pretend that everything is false. You try to find as many reasons as you can why this is wrong that's in the text. And to code each response, Peter asked us to color our believing comments in blue, our doubting comments in red. This helped because it clearly distinguished the responses from the text and then visually displayed the balance or imbalance between peer praise and critique of the work, which I think is helpful when I'm responding to a student work. it's really easy to be critical, right? So I often try to challenge myself to really be specific and articulate about what the paper does well, and I think this really calls attention to that. Moreover, Peter asked us to identify ourselves through initials to make this process transparent. Now, I want to end by talking about how I use this technique in my teaching of literature course. I stole this strategy and use it with my graduate students who are pre-service or in-service secondary or college teachers developing their literature pedagogy. And I asked them to observe classes of their colleagues or professors and write observation reports. Now in the past I had them just submit these directly to me, but because I thought the reports were so important and the rest of the class could benefit from them, I decided to post them to the wiki and then ask students to respond to them using the believing and doubting heuristic. I didn't ask them to include their initials, which was a mistake, because I could look them up, as Ellie pointed out, in the history page, but it required a lot of labor to do it. I was pleased, though, that some students embraced this task and readily employed that dialectical method. For example, one student produced a provocative account about a listless class that seemed incapable of engaging with the course material. The report placed some of the blame on the students, but many of the critiques were directed at the instructor, who refused to consider alternative approaches to encourage engagement. In particular, the report emphasized the instructor's initial failure to incorporate in-class activities that gave students an opportunity to get to know each other. And this prompted the following exchange. And I won't read this, but so this is the student that's responding to the report, and then this is the writer of the report who's actually disagreeing, defending the point. This also, I didn't include that slide. There were also cases where, of course, the student heard the critique and actually revised based on that critique. So, because time is running short, I want to end with this. Henry Thoreau made this famous statement before the Concord Lyceum in April of 1838. He complained that the mass never comes up to the standard of its best member, but on the contrary degrades itself to a level with the lowest. I think that for some mobs, particularly the kinds that incite violent riots, this is true, right? And in fact, I think while the spirit of this remark seems particularly pessimistic, he may be technically correct. Because more often than not, I find that the well-intentioned crowd does not come up to the standard. It exceeds it. And what makes many of the networks in cyberspace so powerful and pervasive is that they do not insist on hierarchies, individual genius, or even equal contribution. And this is the case with Wikipedia. Clay Shirky has written a book called Cognitive Surplus, where he suggests that Wikipedia offers potential participants the ability to do as much writing or editing as they like, but also as little. By making the size of the smallest contribution very small, and by making the threshold for making that change small as well, Wikipedia maximizes contribution across an enormous range of participation. So if you think back to that crowd review page I showed you, some of the responses were shorter than others because some just had a little bit to offer, some had much more. And the crowdsourcing allows this to happen, right? The imbalance of effort inherent in group work is not a problem for the work itself. It just becomes a problem when we try to assess individual contributions. But if you make the process transparent, it also adds the element of personal responsibility to collaborative work, which I believe can be very productive within the classroom. I think I'll stop there. I could have more to say, but I'll end there. Thank you.
That was very, very interesting. I love thinking about the idea of, I mean, I've been thinking for a long time about what the impact is of having students write and respond and so forth online. But I love the idea that it could be extended to our peer-reviewed journals as well. I think it's a great model. Questions, comments, yeah. I'm sorry, yeah, Ursula. I'm sorry,
Ursula Tate from Political Science. I've just always been curious. I'm sort of just beginning to enter this sort of wiki world and online teaching and all that stuff. But I've always had an underlying concern that how do I know the person on the other end is the student whom I'm evaluating? Do you balance these and compare and contrast the contributions online with spontaneous writings in class, so you know that they just haven't asked their friend to do it because they know they're good at biology or they're good at English, so you go in and do my blogs and my wiki stuff, and I'll do your stuff that I'm good at. You know?
Well, at least my experience as an English teacher is that because I require so much writing that the students do it in many different formats, you start to understand the student's voice, and that becomes quite clear, especially online when that voice is not theirs. And this transparency issue, I think, is one of the greatest challenges I believe that will be faced with 21st century textuality, which is that more than ever, we have to constantly make our sources transparent, where we're getting our information, right? It's become very easy to manipulate information online, retrieve information online, but it's also important that we specify very clearly like how we're doing this, the process that we use, and citing sources carefully. And I don't think we've quite figured this out completely, so the anxiety is definitely real, like where is this information coming from? But at least from my perspective, if you have students writing in a variety of formats, the voice becomes the key issue. And I have not encountered it being, I haven't encountered it being a particular problem within online environments. I mean, it's just as much of a problem with word processed paper. So it's just a problem in general.
No, it is interesting. When I do my online courses, I have them show up, take the photos of on campus, because I don't know. And I think almost all the cases, it was the same as what they did. Otherwise, you don't know that. In sciences, we use a lot of multiple choice questions, concepts and things like that, so you're not doing a lot of writing. You're not pulling that information out. It is worrisome. That's why we still do that.
And students aren't doing as much handwritten writing, and so then when we ask them to do the handwritten writing, they're doing a very different kind of writing that may not express the kind of voice that they can easily express through a keyboard, right? So that also creates problems. There's a disconnect there that even the actual form of technology interrupts.
The other comment I'd add is that students are engaged in both of these instances in a whole series of activities where they're working with other students throughout the semester, or co-hosting and responding to other people throughout the semester. And so, I mean, I guess you could always get some other student to come in and take the course for you, essentially. But it's not like an isolated piece of writing. It isn't so much the same thing as saying, oh, could you give me a copy of your old research report on such and such, and I'll turn it in as mine. Instead, there's a lot of dialogue going on, and so I think that it's harder for a student to imagine that this is a pedagogical context in which to try to have somebody else doing the work or passing it off, as somebody else's office or not.
Well, I think this person had her hand up
Jan?
before.
Yeah, Jan. Okay.
Well, I hate to have to ask this question, because in an ideal world, we wouldn't grade our students and everyone would just want to be engaged and participate and so forth. But the reality is we have to assign letter grades to our students at the end of the semester. So I'm wondering, with the crowd review of students' products that they produce in your class, how does that factor into your grading? Do you grade them for participation, for contributing to the crowd review? And do you take the crowd reviews into account when you assign the grade to those products?
Well, since I just started this, all of those things you said I would like to do, but I have not done yet. I would like to have some clear guidelines for review that I could assess. But mostly now it's participation. And I mean, this is the essential problem with group work, right? I mean, the contribution is never going to be equal. I mean, it's just it never will be. There will always be a student that does more than the other. So it seems to me that group work can only occur within, with a balance of more individual activities, so that you can, I mean, I think the reality is that we're drawn to more collaboration in our work, but that's because collaboration produces good work, not because we necessarily can always tell which contributor did what. And so that's a shift in the way that we think about things, and it is a problem pedagogically, because we can't parse out often who did what. I mean, you can, but it often requires a lot of work, and so I would like to develop some structures for it, but I haven't yet. So if you have some, please
Well, we
send
can
it
talk.
to me. Okay.
I can just say that I do like the history piece as a way in the Wikipedia, as a way of having students themselves be able to reflect on their own participation in the project and what they've contributed or what they've contributed. I don't know, I'd have to think more about using your believing in doubt in different colors pieces, but it's an interesting
Great, I like that idea of
Yeah.
making the students reflect on their own participation and write about it using evidence to
The
show
evidence
how
of,
they
yeah, right,
participated
and
in
this
it,
does
yeah.
make the evidence
Yeah.
available, do you?
Yeah, it's just side comment, sidebar. You know, technology is not the reason that students might, necessarily is what leads students to get somebody else to write the. No, I'm just saying, you know, that's sort of an issue that is a great concern to a lot of people, even if you don't use the blog spaces, so, yeah. But what I wanted to ask, Alex, was whether you thought about this issue of transparency and the impact it has when you sort of own up that you're identifying yourself, and the ways in which that then affects the kind of response you give and not. I don't know if your students are here in this, from your
Some
course.
of them are,
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, I was thinking about you could obviously do both in your class, have an exercise in which they do identify themselves, another one in which they don't,
Right.
and have your students actually look at the nature and the quality of the response
Yeah.
to see how not identifying themselves affected, whether they can sort of become meta-level sort of analysis of how this affected them,
Right.
because then obviously that's going to be something that they want to consider in their own teaching at some point.
Right, yeah, so for the teaching of literature class, I think it's important that we all get used to the idea that we will be responding to student work, and the student will know that these critiques come from us, right? And that adds another level of responsibility to how you articulate your response to that student. And so I think that and this also informs my kind of evolving feelings about transparent peer review within the academic world, which is that fundamentally I should believe that I'd be willing to say to your face what I would also say anonymously, right? I mean, that may be a naive way of thinking about things, but I think that it is true that we should be offering critiques that we're willing to own up to and say, you know what, this is my critique of your work. But it's hard to develop that. And that's why I found anonymity to be attractive for a lot of students, is that they have a chance to kind of try things out, try a voice out, without having necessarily to own up to it to the rest of their classmates. So yeah, I think a balance is good.
No, it's not even, I'm not even suggesting one or the other, it's
Yeah.
just, but really to sort of see what it is that the students themselves are saying about what happens when the circumstances shift in this way.
Yeah.
Does it affect the kinds of things that they would say?
Oh, I'm
I think
sure
it's
it
an
does.
interesting sort of
I mean, yes, I mean,
experiment.
I think it does.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm sure all of us have received reviews of our work that we thought were completely unfair, and probably in some cases we thought were particularly mean-spirited, and we wonder if this person, if the person were identified, would they put forth that same critique? Probably
Yeah.
not.
Or at least in the same tone.
Yeah, right.
Why don't you go ahead?
Alex's class, we were to rid ourselves of our identities, I feel I would be able to actually pick out my peers' voices, because like I've been working with them. I kind of know what they have to say.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it is true. Well, I mean, in the anonymity that I referred to briefly in my presentation had to do with an assignment where I asked students to take on the voices of characters. So you may have been able to still pinpoint like who those students were. Maybe they couldn't disguise their voice, but the assignment was actually that they take on another character's voice, another persona on the blog. And so there, at the end of the class, we often had kind of an outing day, like where students said, "Oh, I was this character and I was this character." And but I do think the reflective piece is important, that they write about what that experience was like, how they would assess their contributions.
Someone else had their hand up and I already
Oh,
spoke, so.
This is something totally different from this kind of a discussion, but I'm thinking about a pen that has come out, which I think all of you know about the Livescribe, which writes and you can record and you can transfer it to the computer. So what will be the role of that? Because in summer I had a student writing on a special notebook and with a special pen and transferring it to her, the notes to her notebook. And so you were asking the class writing compared to typing on the computer. Would that be a thing, which is right now very expensive? It's going to come down, but it's still $200 for one pen. That will be difficult, and a special notebook. But that technology, how are we going to incorporate? Because if I had to write a book, I'd like to write with handwriting, and that will be the best source right now.
See, and I wouldn't. Like personally, my handwriting has always been terrible, and it's always, I felt like, been an impediment to my own production of text. And so I think it would depend. I mean, if you felt if it were you, yes, it would probably be a better way of representing your textual self. But for me, I mean, the speed of typing something out is so much greater that I would
And it has the
prefer
sound
that.
too.
It has a sound too.
Yeah.
You
So
mean the
the
sound of the
students are
keyboarding,
recording the notes.
or it makes a sound the actual pen does?
No, you are speaking,
keyboard.
it will be recorded. So if you speak and write,
Oh,
it's
I
like
see.
a talking book.
Oh, really? Okay. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the believing and doubting. I think that's it's really good, because I know that when I'm doing a critique of any kind, you know, a lot of times early on, I kind of lean one way or the other, and I can find myself kind of prejudicing myself at the very beginning throughout the rest of the essay, and I've already made up my mind in terms of what I'm feeling about this. But I think with this thing, you're forced really to have a perspective in both directions, and I think it's really good actually for the reviewer to be able to kind of develop that skill in terms of being.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really liked it. I mean, when I was actually participating in this seminar and doing it myself, I realized, wow, I need to think about this. I mean, the fact that it was, these were kind of hats that I had to put on as a believer and a doubter was really helpful for me as a responder to be specific about what kind of response I was offering. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great, I mean, obviously, it's an important model to think about when we're responding to students' work.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if we had a believing and doubting response, and actually making that whole process transparent to students, that you're going to be using this game by Peter Elbow, you know, that is going to be a response to them that suggests both, you know, not just the sort of typical kind of responding behavior, which is, you know, I can see you've worked here, but, and then you get the list of all the things that are problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, I did have difficulty, like, what about the in-between space of believing and doubting? How do you express that? Because I often feel that way.
In a sense, being a believer and then a doubter is role-playing.
Yes.
And it goes back to what you're saying about how role-playing allows you a degree of freedom that you don't have when you play yourself.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about role playing, but I mean, essentially, we are always playing these different roles, like when, you know, within these contexts, and it's calling attention to the role that it's important, because you know, it really makes it clear, transparent, you know, how you're, you know, where you're responding from. So, I think that that's a value we should encourage.
I
This is
think
Jenna
it's-
Jackson, who's in curriculum and instruction in the College of Education and Human Development. I always have to keep up with college names changes.
And she helped me develop my teaching English with technology.
With the crowd reviews, me and some colleagues did some, we called it cross-assessing, where we got multiple professors to evaluate student papers, and we found that students would, a lot of students would only pay attention to the feedback they got from their assigned professor, because they knew that professor was going to give them a grade, and they ignored the feedback from the other professors. So I'm curious, with the crowd review, do you weigh in on the review? If the, only pay attention to you, is there an advantage to the professor being anonymous?
Yeah. Well, then there are these hierarchies that emerge, of course. So, yeah, I mean, the guy I pointed out, the Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, is really famous in my field. And so what he says is probably gonna matter a lot more to that writer than what I might say. So yeah, I mean, it does. A new hierarchy emerges. But even in Wikipedia, there have been books written about this. There are hierarchies within Wikipedia. I mean, there are certain levels of administration that aren't exactly clear to most all of us. And you should, and also on Wikipedia, if you look at their contribution page, it says anyone can edit almost any page. And you almost skip that word almost.
Yeah.
You can't edit everything. And there have been famous examples where the admin has completely prevented anyone from editing a page.
I found when I was first having students respond to each other's writing online, and I was responding to, of course it made me more visible. I had to be careful and think about what my own responses were like and what effect they were going to have. And I found myself hanging back more and more and trying to see what kind of conversation the students were actually creating among themselves, and then figuring out how to enter that conversation in a way where I wouldn't be such an overpowering voice. But I ended up learning some things. As a teacher, I was always, so concerned about quickly getting to the point of what I wanted the student to do to this paper, And but of course my field of study is discourse analysis, and so if I stepped back and looked from my discourse analyst's hat, I could see very interestingly how these students were tending to the social pragmatic aspect of language and really developing a kind of dialogue with each other, and that I could take cues from that dialogue that in fact made me a more effective responder in the long run. So I think that there's a lot for us to be learning as we work our way through these new modes of operation. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to our two presenters for a very interesting and provocative session. I wanted to mention again that the next forum is going to be on writing, not a technology piece, but on writing, and that's October 18th, 19th.
Where is she when I need it?
Yeah, right. You'll know what the date is, but at any rate.
The 18th?
I think she said 18.
Okay, great. And so, maybe some of you would like to extend this conversation in that context. And I noticed that coming out about that. So, and I think there was a list of participants here, so we can be sure that everybody gets the notice for the next